The old shelter stood quietly at the edge of the small town. It was not a big place, just a row of kennels and a small office, but to the animals who lived there, it was their whole world. Dogs of all shapes and sizes filled the cages. Some barked happily whenever visitors walked in. Others wagged their tails with hope, pressing their noses to the bars, begging for a hand to reach out. Some of the younger puppies jumped and spun in circles, their little paws scratching the metal as if they believed that if they barked loud enough, someone would take them home. But at the end of the row, there was one dog who didn't bark, didn't jump, and didn't even wag his tail when people passed. He was a German shepherd, big and strong, but his fur looked rough and dusty. His ears drooped instead of standing tall like other shepherds, and his eyes were tired, almost as if they had cried without tears. His name, given by the shelter workers, was Shadow. Shadow had once belonged to someone, though no one at the shelter really knew the full story. They only knew that one day he had been brought in by a neighbor, who said his owner had left town and never returned for him. At first, Shadow would pace the kennel, confused and anxious, searching for the familiar face he had lost. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, his hope seemed to drain away. Every Saturday, families came to the shelter. Parents brought children who ran from cage to cage, pointing at dogs they thought looked fun. "That one's cute," one child would say. "Look at that little puppy." Another would laugh. Volunteers would smile and open cages, letting the happy, wagging dogs meet potential families. Papers were signed, leashes were clipped, and another lucky dog would leave with a new home. But no one looked twice at Shadow. When people walked by his kennel, they barely paused. Some gave him a quick glance and muttered, "Too big." Others wrinkled their noses and whispered, "He looks old." The younger dogs, the tiny ones with floppy ears and wagging tails, always got the attention. Shadow sat silently, watching them go one by one. He didn't bark to call anyone over. He didn't jump to show off. He simply sat with his head low, as if he already knew he wasn't wanted. The volunteers at the shelter noticed it too. They were kind people who gave him food, water, and occasional pats through the bars. But even they admitted quietly that his chances of adoption were slim. "Families want a playful dog," one of them said sadly while cleaning his kennel. "They don't see how gentle he really is." Shadow had a deep soul, but nobody could see it because of the quiet way he carried himself. His big paws lay heavy on the concrete floor, his brown and black fur dull under the weak light. Sometimes he would lift his head when he heard laughter from the front of the shelter, his ears twitching, his eyes soft with a wish he didn't dare hold. But every time the sound faded, he laid his head back down, curling against the cold wall of his cage. At night, when the shelter grew still and the barking stopped, Shadow would dream. In his dreams, he was running again in a wide yard, chasing a ball, hearing a voice calling his name with joy. He could almost feel a hand scratching behind his ears and smell the familiar scent of home. But when he woke, the gray walls and the bars were all around him, and the dream slipped away like smoke. The staff tried their best to give him moments of happiness. They took him out for short walks, though he often just walked quietly beside them. Not pulling, not running, just staying close as if he was afraid of losing them too. Children who visited the shelter sometimes reached toward his kennel, but when they saw how calm and serious he was, they usually moved on to a louder, bouncier dog. Time passed slowly. The calendar in the office kept changing. The seasons shifted, and still Shadow waited. Other dogs came and left, their cages filling and emptying like a tide. But Shadow remained like a shadow of what he once was, overlooked and forgotten. And yet, despite it all, there was still a softness in him. His eyes, though tired, had kindness. When a volunteer dropped food into his bowl, he never growled or snapped. He ate politely, licking the bowl clean and then sitting quietly, watching them with gentle patience. Sometimes, late in the evening, one of the staff members would kneel by his cage and whisper, "Don't give up, boy. Someone will come." Shadow would blink slowly, his tail giving one faint wag, as if he wanted to believe but didn't know how anymore. The shelter had seen dogs stay long, but rarely this long. A few people even suggested he might be too old to be adopted. He probably won't live that many more years, they said. But to Shadow, every day was a gift he hoped to spend with someone. He didn't know what age meant or what people thought about him. He only knew that his heart still wanted to belong. And then, one chilly morning, something small but important happened. The door to the shelter opened and a man walked in with his daughter. She was young, maybe 7 or 8, her hair in loose braids, her shoes slightly muddy from the rain outside. She clutched her father's hand tightly, her eyes wide as she looked around at all the barking dogs. The noise was loud, the smell strong, but instead of fear, her face lit with curiosity. The staff came forward to greet them. "Looking for a new friend today?" they asked kindly. The father nodded, explaining that his daughter had been saving her allowance, dreaming of getting a dog. The workers smiled and began to show them the younger dogs, the playful ones bouncing with energy. But the little girl didn't run from cage to cage like the others usually did. She stood still in the middle of the room, her gaze scanning slowly across the kennels. And then, her eyes stopped. Down the row, past the puppies, past the excited barking, she saw Shadow. He was sitting just as always, quiet and calm, his ears low, his eyes watchful but weary. He didn't move when she looked at him. He didn't try to impress her. He just stared back as if he was surprised that someone had finally noticed. The girl let go of her father's hand and walked toward the kennel. Her small steps echoed against the concrete floor. When she reached the bars, she crouched down and tilted her head, meeting his gaze directly. "Hi, buddy," she whispered softly. Shadow's ears twitched. Slowly, very slowly, he lifted his head higher. His tail gave the tiniest flick, as if part of him still remembered how to show joy. The volunteers watching from across the room froze. Shadow hadn't reacted to anyone like that in weeks. The girl smiled, her eyes shining. She didn't look away, didn't back up, didn't rush off to another dog. She just stayed there, speaking gently to him, as if she had found the one she had been searching for all along. For the first time in months, Shadow felt something stir inside him. A small light, fragile but real, hope. Emily's father had expected her to choose one of the lively puppies that bounced around with endless energy. That was the way it usually went. Children loved the excitement, the wagging tails, and the playful barks. But as he followed his daughter through the shelter, he quickly realized she wasn't even looking at those dogs. Her eyes were fixed on the quiet German shepherd at the far end. The volunteers tried to redirect her. "This one is very friendly," one said, pointing to a golden puppy that barked happily. Another encouraged her to meet a smaller dog that spun in circles and wagged its tail so fast it was a blur. But Emily shook her head each time. She walked straight to Shadow's kennel, crouched down, and pressed her little fingers gently against the bars. Shadow, who had been sitting still as stone, blinked slowly and lowered his nose closer to her. His tail brushed softly against the concrete, a faint, cautious wag that no one had seen in weeks. Emily's father frowned a little. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "this one looks old. Maybe you'd rather play with one of the younger dogs?" But Emily didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked with Shadow's as though she could see something no one else noticed. "Daddy," she whispered, "he's sad. Look at his eyes. He just needs a friend." The volunteers exchanged surprised looks. They had said the same thing many times, but no visitor had ever listened. They had always walked away, leaving Shadow behind. But this little girl, small and gentle, saw past his tired fur and drooping ears. She saw the soul inside him. Her father sighed, still uncertain. He wanted his daughter to be happy, and he knew the joy of having a dog. But he also knew how much work it would take, especially with a big shepherd like this one. He might not be easy, he explained. Sometimes older dogs need extra care, and he might not want to play the way you hope. Emily didn't argue. She simply reached her hand through the bar a little more, letting her fingertips rest just inside the cage. Shadow inched closer, step by careful step, until his nose touched her fingers. For a brief moment, everything grew still. The barking around them faded. It was just the girl and the dog, meeting each other with quiet trust. A volunteer, touched by the moment, asked gently, "Would you like to meet him in the play yard? We can bring him out so you can spend some time together." Emily's face lit up. "Yes, please," she said eagerly, turning to her father with pleading eyes. He hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he agreed, though still wary. "But just for a little while." The worker unlocked the kennel and clipped a leash onto Shadow's collar. The German shepherd stood tall but slow, as if unsure what was happening. He followed carefully, his paws heavy on the floor. Emily waited near the gate to the small fenced yard outside. When he walked through, she didn't run to him or shout. Instead, she sat down on the grass, cross-legged, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Shadow stopped a few feet away, studying her. He didn't bark or rush toward her. He simply stood, his ears tilting forward slightly, trying to decide if he could trust this child. Emily didn't pressure him. She just sat there patiently, a small smile on her face. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a few little treats she had brought from home, planning to offer them to whichever dog she met that day. She placed one on the ground near her, not too close, and waited. Shadow looked at it for a long time. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward and sniffed the treat. His nose twitched, his eyes flicked to hers, and then he gently took it into his mouth. He chewed softly, still watching her with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Emily's heart fluttered. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice so gentle it was almost like a secret. She set another treat a little closer to her knee. Shadow sniffed again, took another step, and ate the treat. His tail swished once, uncertain but real. The volunteers watched in awe. They had tried for months to bring out Shadow's spirit, and yet this little girl had done it in only minutes. Emily set the last treat right next to her. For a while, Shadow didn't move. He seemed torn between fear and longing. But then, as though something inside him had decided to take a chance, he padded forward and lowered his head into her lap. Emily froze, her heart racing with joy. She lifted her hand slowly and stroked the fur on his neck. "See, Daddy?" she whispered without looking away from Shadow. "He's not scary. He just needed someone to love him." Her father felt his throat tighten as he watched his daughter gently pet the dog that everyone else had ignored. Shadow closed his eyes halfway, leaning into her touch, his body relaxing in a way the volunteers had never seen. Minutes passed, but to Emily, it felt like no time at all. Shadow stayed close, his ear flicking now and then as she spoke to him softly, telling him about her toys, her school, and how she had always dreamed of a dog to play with. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the kindness in her voice. For the first time in months, Shadow felt safe. Her father finally spoke, his voice a little hesitant. "Sweetheart, are you sure this is the one you want?" "He's not like the others," Emily nodded firmly. "Yes, he's the one." The volunteers smiled, their hearts warmed by her certainty. Still, they knew there would be more to discuss. Adopting a dog, especially one like Shadow, was not a simple choice. They explained gently to Emily's father that Shadow might need time to adjust, that he wasn't the kind of dog to chase balls all day or learn tricks quickly. But as they spoke, Shadow shifted, lying down fully beside Emily, his head resting against her little leg as if to say, "I belong here." Her father looked at them both, the quiet, hopeful dog and the determined little girl. Something inside him softened. He still had doubts, but he couldn't ignore the bond forming right in front of his eyes. As the visit ended and they prepared to leave the shelter, Emily clung to her father's hand, her eyes pleading. "Daddy, please don't make me leave him here." "He needs me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced back at Shadow, who was watching them go with ears tilted and tail resting still. In that moment, he realized what his daughter saw, a soul that had been waiting too long for someone to choose him. When they walked out of the shelter that day, Emily knew one thing for certain: she couldn't forget Shadow. And Shadow, in his quiet way, seemed to know he had finally been seen. It was only the beginning, but something inside both of them had already changed. The next week, Emily could not stop thinking about the German Shepherd. Everywhere she went, his quiet eyes followed her in her memory. When she sat at her desk at school, she thought about the way he had laid his head in her lap. When she brushed her hair in the morning, she remembered his rough fur under her fingers. And at night, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of walking beside him, holding his leash, calling his name. Her father noticed it too. Emily usually chattered about school projects, her dolls, or her drawings, but now she spoke mostly of Shadow. At breakfast, she would say, "Daddy, I wonder if he's warm at night." In the car, she whispered, "Do you think he's still waiting for me?" When she lay in bed, she prayed softly, "Please let Shadow find a home. Please let it be with us." Her father's heart grew heavy. He wanted to give her everything she wished for, but he worried. Adopting a dog was a big responsibility. Shadow wasn't like a little puppy who would adjust quickly. He carried sadness and a history they didn't fully know. Still, he couldn't ignore how deeply his daughter already cared. The following Saturday, Emily asked again, "Daddy, can we please go see him?" Her father sighed, then nodded. "All right. Just a visit," he said, though he knew in his heart that these visits meant more. When they arrived at the shelter, the volunteers greeted them with smiles. They remembered the little girl who had sat so patiently with the dog no one else noticed. "He'll be glad to see you," one worker said kindly, and led them back to Shadow's kennel. As soon as Shadow saw Emily, his body changed. He didn't stay curled in the corner this time. He stood, ears lifting a little higher, tail swishing slowly, eyes brightening with something close to recognition. Emily ran forward, kneeling by the bars. "Hi, Shadow," she whispered. The dog pressed his nose through, sniffing her fingers, his tail wagging just a little faster. Her father's doubts softened again. It was undeniable. Shadow remembered her. This time when they went out to the play yard, Shadow didn't hesitate as much. He walked more steadily, his steps quicker, as though he understood where he was going. Emily sat in the grass again, but she didn't need treats this time. Shadow came straight to her, nudging her hand with his nose, then resting against her side. Emily laughed softly, wrapping her small arms gently around his neck. "I missed you," she said, as if speaking to an old friend. Shadow leaned closer, closing his eyes, his chest rising and falling with a deep sigh of comfort. The volunteers watching nearby felt something stir in their own hearts. They had cared for Shadow for months, trying to coax life back into him, but nothing had worked until this little girl appeared. Now it was as if the dog had remembered how to hope. Over the next few visits, Emily built trust with Shadow. She came every Saturday, sometimes bringing little things from home, a ball, a blanket, even a sketch she had drawn of him. She showed him her picture through the bars, giggling when his nose smudged the paper. She tossed the ball in the yard, and though Shadow didn't always chase it right away, after a few tries he trotted after it and brought it back, laying it near her feet. Each week, he grew braver. At first, he only wagged his tail a little. Then he started licking her hand when she reached out. Finally, one day when she crouched down, he bounded toward her with a spark of energy no one had seen in him before, circling her in excitement before pressing close to her side. The bond between them was clear, as visible as the sun. Emily adored him and Shadow adored her in return. It wasn't just play. It was trust. It was something deeper, something that had been missing from both their lives. Still, her father hesitated. Each time they left, Emily begged to bring Shadow home. And each time he said, "Not yet, sweetheart. We have to think about it." One evening, after tucking Emily into bed, he sat alone in the living room thinking hard. He replayed the image of Shadow's eyes when Emily left each time, how the dog would watch her walk away, his ears dropping again, his tail slowing, as though the light had dimmed. He thought about his daughter too, how she lit up in Shadow's presence, how her kindness and patience brought out the best in the dog. Maybe, he realized, this wasn't about choosing the easiest dog. Maybe it was about choosing the one who needed them most. The next Saturday, Emily's father asked the volunteers more questions. He wanted to know everything: Shadow's health, his habits, his needs. They explained that Shadow was healthy but not young. He might not have the energy of a puppy, but he was gentle and loyal. They admitted he had been overlooked many times. "But with her," one of them said, nodding toward Emily, "he's different. We've never seen him this way." Emily's father knelt beside his daughter in the play yard that day. Shadow sat between them, his head resting in Emily's lap. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, "this isn't just about wanting a dog. It means feeding him every day, walking him, brushing him, cleaning up after him. It means being patient when he's scared or slow. Do you understand?" Emily nodded quickly. "I'll do it all, Daddy, I promise. He's my best friend." Her father smiled faintly, brushing her hair back. "He needs someone who won't give up on him." "I won't," she whispered, hugging Shadow tighter. And from the way Shadow leaned into her, tail thumping gently against the ground, it was clear that he believed her. That evening, as they drove home, Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her hand pressed against the window, staring out at the fading sky. "One day," she whispered softly to herself, "I'll bring him home. He belongs with me." Shadow, back in his kennel at the shelter, curled up on the floor. But tonight he didn't feel as lonely. He could still smell her on his fur, still feel the warmth of her touch. For the first time in many months, he closed his eyes and drifted into sleep with peace in his heart. The trust between a little girl and an ignored dog had begun to grow roots, deep and strong. And though neither of them knew it yet, their lives were about to change forever. The days that followed became a mix of excitement and worry in Emily's home. She talked about Shadow all the time, her voice filled with hope and determination. She told her friends at school about him, drawing little pictures of the big German shepherd in her notebooks. She even kept a jar in her room where she placed coins and small bills, calling it Shadow's Fund, though she wasn't exactly sure how much was needed. Her father, however, still carried doubts. He cared for his daughter deeply and he wanted her happiness, but he also felt the heavy responsibility of caring for a dog, especially one who had been abandoned before. He wanted to make sure they were making the right choice, not just for Emily but for Shadow too. One evening, Emily overheard her father talking on the phone with her grandmother. His voice was serious. "He's older," he said. "German shepherds are strong dogs. What if he gets sick? What if Emily grows tired of the work? It's not like picking up a toy you can put back." Emily pressed her ear against the wall, her small hands clutching at her dress. Her heart sank, but she whispered to herself, "I won't give up. He's mine." The next Saturday, they returned to the shelter again. By now, the staff recognized them the moment they walked in. Shadow, too, recognized Emily's voice before she even reached his kennel. He stood eagerly, ears perked, his tail wagging with steady rhythm. The moment the door opened, he rushed to her side, pressing his nose into her hand as though he feared she might disappear. Emily's father watched closely, his doubts battling with the scene before him. Shadow's whole body seemed alive in her presence, so different from the lifeless creature he had first seen. This time, after their playtime in the yard, Emily's father sat down with the volunteers in the office. He asked about adoption fees, paperwork, vaccinations, and Shadow's medical history. The volunteers answered honestly. "He's healthy for his age," one of them said. "But like all older dogs, he may need more checkups as time goes on. Still, he's calm, loyal, and gentle. With the right family, he could thrive." Emily sat in the corner of the office, hugging Shadow, listening intently. Her little heart beat faster when she realized her father was asking serious questions this time. She clung to hope, her fingers tangled in Shadow's thick fur. But when they left the office, her father knelt down to her level. "Emily," he said softly, "we need to think about this carefully. Some people are saying maybe another family might want him, or maybe we should wait until we're more ready." Her face fell. She looked at Shadow, who stood quietly beside her as if he too understood the weight of the conversation. She hugged him tightly. "But Daddy," she whispered, "what if no one else comes? What if they just keep walking past him? He's been waiting so long." Her words pierced her father's heart. He lifted his gaze to Shadow, who met his eyes silently. In that look, the man saw not just an animal, but a soul, tired, patient, and longing for a home. That night, Emily's father sat at the kitchen table, staring at the adoption papers the shelter had given him. He turned them over in his hands again and again. He wanted to be practical. He wanted to protect his daughter from disappointment, but he also couldn't deny what he had seen. Emily's love was not a passing fancy. It was steady and real, and Shadow's transformation under her care was undeniable. The next morning, Emily found him at the table with a cup of coffee. She tiptoed closer, her eyes still sleepy. "Daddy?" she asked in a small voice. "Are we going to bring him home?" He looked at her, then sighed, a smile tugging faintly at his lips. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "if we do this, it has to be forever. No giving up when it gets hard. No leaving him behind like before. Do you promise?" Her eyes shone like the morning sun. "I promise, Daddy. I'll take care of him every day." Her father nodded slowly. "Then I think it's time." Emily's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with joy. She leaped forward, hugging him tightly. "Thank you. Thank you. He's going to be so happy." Later that week, they returned to the shelter one final time. The staff had already prepared Shadow's papers. When Emily and her father walked in, the room seemed to glow with excitement. The volunteers smiled, their eyes misty with happiness. "Today's the day," one whispered. Shadow sensed it too. When the kennel door opened, he didn't hesitate. He bounded forward, tail wagging, head high, as if he knew that the wait was finally over. Emily clapped her hands with joy, kneeling down to hug him as the red collar and leash were fitted snugly around his neck. As they walked out of the shelter, people turned their heads. The once-forgotten dog now strode proudly beside his little girl, his eyes bright and his step strong. Emily held the leash firmly, her heart bursting with happiness. Shadow glanced up at her often, as if checking to make sure this was real, as if asking, "Is this forever?" She squeezed the leash gently, leaning down to whisper, "Yes, Shadow, you're coming home." On the ride back, Emily rested her head against Shadow's side, her fingers running through his fur. He lay calmly, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been in a long, long time. Outside the car window, the town passed by, but inside, everything was changing. When they reached home, Shadow stepped carefully onto the driveway, sniffing the air, his ears alert. Emily tugged gently, guiding him inside. "This is your home now," she said proudly. Shadow walked through the doorway, pausing as though to mark the moment. Then he wagged his tail, his eyes shining with something clear and new: belonging. Her father watched from behind, his doubts melting away as he saw the joy in both of them. This wasn't just adoption, it was destiny. A lonely dog who had been ignored by everyone had finally found his family. And a little girl who had dreamed of a friend had finally found her protector. From that day forward, Shadow's life was no longer measured by the cold days in a kennel. It was measured in warmth, laughter, and love, and it was only the beginning of their journey together. Shadow's first night at Emily's home was full of new discoveries. He walked carefully through every room, sniffing the corners, patting softly on the wooden floors. His ears twitched at every sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the window. It was all strange to him, but Emily stayed close, her small hand resting gently on his back. When it was time for bed, Emily spread a blanket on the floor beside her bed. "This is your spot, Shadow," she whispered. Shadow circled twice, then curled himself onto the blanket. He let out a deep sigh, the kind that comes only when fear begins to fade. For the first time in months, he wasn't in a cage or on a cold floor. He was beside someone who had chosen him. Emily lay awake longer than usual that night, her eyes on the gentle rise and fall of Shadow's chest. She smiled softly, knowing she wasn't just a little girl with a dog anymore. She was his person and he was hers. The next morning, the house felt different. Shadow followed Emily everywhere, his paws tapping quietly as he trailed her from the kitchen to the yard. When she sat at the breakfast table, he lay at her feet, his eyes half closed but watchful. Her father noticed it immediately. "He really doesn't let you out of his sight, does he?" he said, half smiling. Emily grinned. "That's because he knows I'm his family now." Days turned into weeks, and Shadow began to change in ways no one at the shelter had thought possible. His fur, once dull and rough, grew shinier with regular care. His ears perked more often, and his tail wagged freely now, not just in half-hearted swishes but in full, strong sweeps that thudded against the furniture. He barked sometimes, too, not the desperate barks of a shelter dog, but the proud, deep bark of a guardian announcing his place in the world. Emily was faithful to her promise. Every morning, she filled his water bowl before school and checked his food. After school, she rushed home, dropping her bag on the floor and running outside with him. She brushed his fur gently, laughing when he leaned against her for more. On weekends, she took him to the park, throwing sticks that he fetched with slow but happy steps. She didn't mind that he wasn't as fast as the other dogs. To her, he was perfect just as he was. The bond between them deepened each day. At night, Shadow slept faithfully by her bed. When thunder rolled across the sky one evening, Emily woke with a start, afraid of the storm. Shadow lifted his head, pressed his warm body against the side of her bed, and stayed there until she fell asleep again. His presence was steady and comforting, like a silent promise: "I'm here. You're safe." Emily's father, too, began to see the change not only in Shadow but in his daughter. Emily had always been kind, but now she showed a deeper sense of responsibility. She never forgot Shadow's needs. She cleaned up after him without complaint, and she woke early on weekends just to walk him. Her father realized this wasn't just about a little girl wanting a pet. This was about love that ran both ways. One evening, something happened that would forever prove how much Shadow had become a true member of the family. Emily's father had left a pan on the stove by mistake. It was late, and the family was resting in the living room when Shadow suddenly sprang to his feet. His ears shot up and he trotted quickly toward the kitchen. A moment later, he barked, loud, sharp, urgent. Emily and her father rushed to see what was wrong. Smoke was beginning to rise from the stove, filling the air with the acrid smell of something burning. Emily's father quickly turned off the stove and opened the windows. "Good boy, Shadow," he exclaimed, kneeling down to rub the dog's neck. "You just saved us." Emily hugged him tightly, tears of pride in her eyes.
"See, Daddy?"
"He's not just a dog. He's our hero." From then on, no one doubted that Shadow belonged. Neighbors who had once questioned the choice of adopting an older dog began to admire him. They saw how he walked proudly beside Emily, always watchful, always protective. They noticed how gentle he was with younger children who came to play, lowering his head so they could pet him. They saw the joy on Emily's face, the way her laughter seemed brighter since Shadow entered her life. Months passed, and Shadow settled completely into his new home. He had a favorite spot by the window where he loved to lie in the sunlight. He had a favorite toy, a squeaky ball that Emily had bought with her own allowance. And most of all, he had his favorite person, Emily. Every afternoon, he waited at the door for her return from school. The moment she appeared, his tail wagged furiously and he greeted her as though she had been gone for years. One day, Emily's teacher asked the class to write about their best friend. While others wrote about classmates or cousins, Emily wrote about Shadow. She described how everyone had ignored him, how he had looked so sad in the shelter, and how he had changed after finding love. She ended her essay with simple words. "He's my best friend because he needed me, and I needed him." Her teacher shared the essay with the class, and many children smiled, touched by the story. As seasons changed, Shadow grew older still, but his spirit stayed strong. He might not have had the energy of a puppy, but he had something even greater: loyalty. He never left Emily's side. On long walks, he slowed to match her pace. When she read books in her room, he lay quietly nearby. And when she laughed, his tail wagged as if her joy was his own. Emily often thought back to that first day in the shelter. She remembered how no one had wanted him, how people had looked past him for younger dogs, and she remembered the moment his eyes met hers, how something deep inside her had whispered, "He's the one." She felt proud knowing she had been right. Her father, too, sometimes watched them together, his heart swelling with pride. He had once doubted the choice, but now he knew it had been the best decision of all. Shadow hadn't just changed Emily's life. He had changed the whole family. Years later, when Emily grew older, she would often look at pictures of that first day. The sad, tired dog in the kennel, and the small girl who refused to give up on him. She would smile softly, remembering how everything had started with one simple moment of kindness. The German shepherd that everyone ignored had become the center of a little girl's world. And in return, he gave her not just love, but courage, loyalty, and unforgettable memories. Their story proved something simple yet powerful. Sometimes the ones the world overlooks are the ones who can change everything, if only someone takes the time to see them. Shadow had been a shadow in the shelter, unseen and forgotten. But with Emily, he became something more. He became family. And that made all the difference.